The rain had not stopped for 11 days. It fell in silver curtains across the Cathara Valley, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud, flooding the lowland fields where the barley had just begun to sprout. The village of Durnholt clung to the hillside like a stubborn thing refusing to be washed away, its stone walls dark with moisture, its thatched roof sagging under the weight of so much water. Smoke rose thin and pale from chimney holes, barely visible against the gray sky, carrying with it the smell of damp wood and poverty. Marin Ashward stood at the edge of the village, just beyond the last fence post, and stared down into the valley below. He was 32 years old. His hair was the color of wet ash, cut short and uneven because he did it himself with a dulled blade. His face was narrow, weathered by sun and wind and years of labor that had bent his spine just slightly forward, giving him the permanent look of a man apologizing for taking up space. His hands were rough, calloused, the knuckles swollen from gripping tools since he was old enough to hold them. He wore a threadbare coat that had been patched so many times it was more stitched than original fabric. He was, by every measure the world cared to use, a nobody. The villagers of Durnholt knew him as the quiet one, the one who brought in extra firewood for the elders when the cold came, the one who fixed the bridge after the spring floods without being asked and without accepting payment, the one who sat alone at the edge of every gathering, watching with dark eyes that seemed to hold more thought than a man of his station had any right to carry. They did not dislike him, they simply did not see him. And that was fine. Marin had learned long ago that being unseen was its own kind of armor. Tonight, though, he had seen something he should not have seen. It had been just past dusk, during the brief lull between the last of the daylight fading and the true dark settling in. He had gone to check his snares along the lower ridge, the ones he kept hidden from the other villagers because if they knew he was catching rabbit beyond the approved hunting grounds, there would be fines, and fines were things Marin could not afford. He had been walking the familiar path, his boots sinking deep into the mud when he heard the sound. Not a human sound, not an animal sound either. Something between a breath and a whimper so low it vibrated in the ground beneath his feet. He had stopped, listened, felt his heartbeat quicken in the way that all prey animals feel it when a shadow passes overhead. The sound came again. And then, through a break in the tree line, illuminated by a single bolt of lightning that split the sky like a crack in a stone wall, he saw it. A dragon. He knew what it was immediately, even though he had never seen one before. No one in Durnholt had. Dragons had been driven from the valley generations ago, hunted by the Tethrian Empire's dragon slayers, pushed into the far mountains where the air was too thin and the pickings too scarce. They were legend now. Stories told to children to keep them from wandering too far from home. Be good or the dragons will get you. Be quiet or the dragons will hear you. But this was no legend. It was lying in a shallow depression in the earth, half submerged in rainwater and mud. Its scales were black, or had been once, now they were dulled, cracked in places, flacking away like burnt bark from a dead tree. Its wings were folded against its body, and even from a distance Marin could see that the left one was torn, the membrane shredded in a long, ragged gash that ran from the joint to the trailing edge. Its head was lowered, resting on the ground, and its eyes, enormous, slitted. The color of molten copper, were half-lidded, unfocused, barely aware of his presence. It was small, or rather it was young. Perhaps the length of 3 horses end to end, not the mountain-sized beasts of the old stories. A juvenile, an adolescent maybe, it was impossible for Marin to know. He only knew that it was hurt and that it was starving and that every bone in its body seemed to press against its skin with painful visibility. The sound it made was not a roar. It was not a threat. It was the sound of something that had been alone and in pain for so long that it had forgotten how to be afraid. Marin should have walked away. Every rational thought in his mind screamed at him to turn around, to go back to the village, to forget what he had seen. Dragons were illegal. Harboring a dragon was a death sentence. The Tethrian garrison at Ashen Crossing would burn an entire village to the ground for less. The Empire had spent 2 centuries eradicating dragons from the civilized lands, and they did not tolerate exceptions. But Marin did not walk away. He stood there in the rain, watching the creature breathe, and he felt something shift inside his chest. It was not pity exactly. Pity was too small a word, it was recognition. He knew what it felt like to be hungry in a way that food could not fix. He knew what it felt like to be hurt in a place that no one could see. He knew what it felt like to be alone, so profoundly alone that the world itself seemed to have turned its back on you. He knew these things the way a man knows his own heartbeat. So he did the only thing that made sense to him, the thing that would have made no sense to anyone else. He went home, he filled a sack with what little food he had: half a loaf of hard bread, a strip of dried salted meat, 2 potatoes, a handful of oats. He filled a second sack with clean bandaging cloth and a small clay pot of herb salve that he kept for treating wounds on the livestock. He slung both sacks over his shoulder and walked back into the rain, back down the ridge, back to the place where the dragon lay dying in the mud. He approached slowly. The dragon's eyes tracked him, but it did not move. It did not have the strength to move. Its copper eyes watched him with an intelligence that was unsettling, that was almost human in its depth, and Marin felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing pressing against his chest. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. The dragon blinked once slowly. Marin knelt in the mud beside it, ignoring the cold water seeping through his trousers, and he opened the first sack. He broke the bread into pieces and laid them on a flat stone. He tore the dried meat into strips. He placed the potatoes where the dragon could see them. The dragon did not eat. Marin waited, the rain fell, minutes passed. He could hear his own pulse in his ears, could feel the cold creeping into his fingers, and still the dragon did not eat. He understood it was too weak to lift its head, or too proud, or too afraid, perhaps all three. So Marin picked up a piece of bread, and he pressed it gently against the dragon's mouth. For a long moment, nothing happened. The dragon's breath was hot against his hand, carrying with it a smell of smoke and stone and something ancient, something that had no name in any language Marin knew. Its teeth were visible just behind its lips, black, curved, each one as long as his finger. Then its tongue emerged. It was rough, dry, cracked. It curled around the bread and drew it into the dark interior of its mouth. Marin heard a soft crunch, a swallow. He fed it another piece, and another. The dried meat came next, then the potatoes, which the dragon crushed without chewing, swallowing them almost whole. The oats he scattered on the wet stone, and the dragon licked them up with a tongue that was slowly becoming moist again. When the food was gone, Marin opened the second sack. The wing was worse up close. The tear was not a clean wound. It had the jagged, irregular shape of something caused by a blade, not an accident. Someone had cut this dragon. Someone had tried to kill it and had failed, leaving it to die slowly instead of quickly. The edges of the wound were inflamed, weeping fluid that was neither blood nor pus, but something in between, something that glowed faintly with an inner light. Marin had never treated a dragon wound before. He had treated cattle, sheep, the occasional dog, but the principles were the same: clean the wound, apply the salve, bind it gently, hope. He worked in silence, his hands steady despite the trembling in his chest. The dragon watched him the entire time, those copper eyes following every movement with a focus that made Marin feel like the most important person in the world. No one had ever looked at him like that. No one had ever looked at him at all. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at what he had done. The wing was bound, clumsy and uneven, but covered. The dragon had been fed. It was not enough, it would take much more than one meal to save a creature this far gone, but it was a start. "I'll come back," Marin said. The dragon blinked again, that slow, deliberate blink. Marin stood, gathered his empty sacks, and walked away through the rain. He did not look back, but he felt the dragon's eyes on him until he crested the ridge and disappeared from view. He came back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. For 3 weeks, Marin Ashwood stole food from his own meager supplies and carried it down the ridge to the dying dragon. He brought bread when he had it, meat when he could trade for it, roots and tubers and whatever else he could scavenge without being noticed. He brought water in a leather skin, clean water from the well, because the rainwater that pooled around the dragon was filthy and he worried about infection. He brought more salve, more bandages, and he changed the dressing on the wing every third day, each time seeing a little more progress, a little less of that ominous glow. The dragon grew stronger. Slowly, so slowly that Marin barely noticed. From one night to the next, the creature changed. Its scales began to regain their luster, the black deepening to an iridescent darkness that seemed to drink the light around it. Its eyes grew brighter, more focused, more aware. It began to lift its head on its own, to turn and look at Marin when he approached rather than waiting for him to come to it. It began to make sounds, not the pained whimper of that first night, but low rumbling vibrations that Marin felt in his bones. Sounds that seemed to carry meaning just beyond the edge of his understanding. On the 14th night, the dragon ate from his hand without him having to press the food to its mouth. On the 18th night, it moved its injured wing, just slightly, just a fraction, testing the healing membrane with a care that spoke of intelligence and self-awareness. On the 21st night, Marin sat beside the dragon in the rain, his back against its warm flank, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel alone. He talked to it. He had no idea if it understood, but he talked anyway. He told it about Dernholt, about the people who didn't see him, about the work he did and the small satisfactions he took from it. He told it about his parents, both dead now, his mother from the winter fever when he was 19, his father from a logging accident when he was 23. He told it about the girl he had loved once, Helene, who had married the blacksmith's son because the blacksmith's son had a future and Marin Ashwood had nothing. He told it things he had never told another living soul. Not because the dragon could respond, but because it listened. It listened with those enormous copper eyes with that steady, unwavering attention, and in that listening, Marin felt something he had not felt in years. He felt like he mattered. The dragon began to hunt on its own around the end of the first month. Marin came down one evening to find the remains of a deer scattered across the clearing, bones cracked and stripped clean, and the dragon watching him from a slightly higher position on the ridge, its head held high for the first time. It looked different, stronger, larger somehow, though that might have been an illusion created by the way it now carried itself, with a dignity that had been absent before. Marin stopped bringing food after that, but he kept coming. He came every night without fail, rain or shine, and he would sit with the dragon in the darkness and talk. Sometimes for hours, sometimes in silence. The dragon had begun to respond to his voice in subtle ways, a shift of its head, a change in the pitch of its rumbling, a slow blink that Marin had come to understand as acknowledgement, as agreement, as something very close to affection. He named it. He knew he shouldn't. The old stories said that naming a dragon gave it power over you, that the bond between a named dragon and its namer was unbreakable, that such bonds were the reason dragons had once been hunted to near extinction. The Empire's propaganda was clear on this point. Dragons were not pets. Dragons were not friends. Dragons were weapons of the old world, dangerous and unpredictable, and any human who allied with one was a traitor to their species. Marin named it anyways. He called it Thurin. He chose the name from an old word in the pre-Empire dialect that his grandmother had taught him before she died. It meant the one who endures. He spoke it aloud one night, quietly, almost whispering, as if the darkness itself might overhear and report him. Thurin, he said. The dragon went still. Every muscle in its massive body tensed, and for one terrible moment, Marin thought he had made a mistake, that the old stories were right, that naming a dragon was a forbidden act that would bring ruin upon him. Then Thurin exhaled a long, slow breath that carried warmth and the faintest flicker of flame within it, and pressed its enormous head against Marin's chest with a gentleness that would have been impossible for a creature of its size if Marin hadn't felt it himself. The weight of that head was enormous. The heat was intense, like leaning against a furnace door in winter. Marin's hand trembled as he raised it and placed it on the dragon's snout, feeling the scales beneath his palm, smooth and warm and alive. "I've got you," Marin whispered. "You're going to be all right." Thurin closed its eyes and made a sound that Marin would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to others and failing every time. It was not a purr. It was not a growl. It was something deeper than both, something that resonated in the marrow of his bones, something that felt like the world itself humming in contentment. The second month brought changes that Marin had not anticipated. Thurin's wing healed. Not completely, the membrane would always bear a scar, a thin line of slightly different texture where the cut had been, but well enough to fly. Marin knew this because one evening he arrived at the clearing to find it empty. He stood there in the fatting light, his heart hammering, his mind racing through every possible explanation, most of them terrible, and he was on the verge of calling out, of breaking every rule of secrecy he had maintained for 2 months, when a shadow passed overhead. He looked up. Thurin descended from the sky like a falling star, wings spread wide, black scales catching the last of the daylight and throwing it back in shards of deep purple and dark blue. It landed in the clearing with a grace that belied its size, sending up a spray of mud and rainwater, and it turned to look at Marin with an expression that he could only describe as triumphant. Marin laughed. He actually laughed, out loud in the rain, a sound so foreign to his own ears that it startled him. He pressed both hands to his face and felt the wetness there, and he was not entirely sure how much of it was rain and how much of it was tears. Thurin flew more after that. It would vanish for hours at a time, soaring over the valley and the mountains beyond, exploring a world that it had been too weak to see for what might have been months before Marin found it. But it always came back. Every night as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to emerge, Marin would hear the beat of wings overhead, and Thurin would land in the clearing and settle beside him, and they would share the darkness together. The third month was when Marin noticed the first signs of what was to come. It started with the scales. Black had always been Thurin's color, but now the black was changing, not fading, deepening, becoming a black so absolute that looking at it felt like looking into a void, into a space where light went to die. And within that black, Marin began to see faint movements, subtle shifts of color that were not quite color, patterns that were not quite patterns, as if something vast and incomprehensible was moving just beneath the surface of the dragon's skin. Then came the eyes. The copper had been beautiful, warm, alive. But slowly, over the course of weeks, the copper began to lighten, to brighten, until Thurin's eyes were no longer the color of metal, but of fire. Not ordinary fire, something brighter, something that hurt to look at directly, something that seemed to contain depths and distances that had no place in a living creature's gaze. Marin did not understand what was happening. He was a village laborer, not a scholar. He had never studied dragon lore, never read the ancient texts that the Empire had burned by the thousands, never learned the things that had been lost when the old world was destroyed. He did not know that dragons, unlike almost any other living thing, were capable of something called the Ascension, a transformation that occurred when a dragon survived a near-death experience and was nurtured back to health by a being of pure intention. He did not know that the bond formed between a dragon and its caretaker during such a recovery was not merely emotional but metaphysical, that it created a conduit through which something ancient and immense could flow. He only knew that Thurin was changing, and that the changes were both beautiful and terrifying. On the night of the 87th day, Thurin spoke. Marin had been sitting with his back against the dragon's side, as usual talking about nothing in particular, the quality of the barley harvest, the argument between the miller's wife and the baker over the price of flour, the small absurdities of village life that made up the entirety of his existence. He had just paused to take a breath when a voice, not a rumble, not a vibration, but an actual voice, deep and resonant and unmistakably intelligent, sounded in his mind. "You talk too much, Marin Ashward." Marin went rigid, every muscle in his body locked. His breath stopped. For a long, terrible moment, he thought he had lost his mind, that the isolation and the secrecy and the strain of living two lives had finally cracked him open. Then Thurin shifted beside him, and that enormous head came around to look at him directly, and those eyes of living fire were filled with something that Marin could only describe as amusement. "Do not be afraid," the voice said in his mind. It was warm, it carried the texture of stone and smoke and starlight. "I have been understanding you for some time now, I simply lacked the strength to respond." Marin's mouth opened, closed, opened again. He sounded like a fish pulled from the river. "You," his voice cracked, he swallowed hard, "you can talk. I can communicate, the distinction matters to my kind." Thurin's head tilted slightly, a gesture that Marin had come to recognize as curiosity. "You named me." Yes. You know what that means." "No," Marin admitted, "I don't." Thurin was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, the voice in Marin's mind was softer, carrying in weight that felt like the pressure of deep water. "It means that you are mine," Thurin said. "And I am yours, not in the way of ownership, in the way of inevitability. You gave me your name and I accepted it, and the bond between us is now woven into the fabric of things that are larger than either of us can perceive." Marin stared at the dragon. His heart was beating so hard he could feel it in his throat, in his temples, in the tips of his fingers. "I don't understand," he said. "You will," Thurin closed its eyes. "But not yet. There are things that must happen first, changes that I am undergoing that I do not fully understand myself. I only know that they are happening because of you, and that when they are complete nothing will be the same." "For you or for me?" "For everything." Marin did not sleep that night. He lay in his small cot in his small house and stared at the ceiling and felt the world shifting beneath him like tectonic plates grinding slowly toward an earthquake. Thurin's words echoed in his mind, repeating in an endless loop, each repetition raising more questions than it answered. "Changes that I am undergoing because of you." Because of him, a nobody. A man so insignificant that his own neighbors forgot he existed between interactions. How could anything as vast and ancient as what Thurin described be caused by someone like him? But Thurin had said it, and Marin had learned over the course of 3 months that Thurin did not say things it did not mean. The days that followed were strange. Thurin continued to change at an accelerating pace. Its size increased not dramatically, not all at once, but noticeably inch by inch, day by day, as if its body was stretching towards something it had not yet reached. The void black of its scales deepened until looking at Thurin directly became uncomfortable, like staring into an eclipse. Its presence in the clearing became heavier, more dense, as if the air around it was being compressed by something inherent to its being. And the voice in Marin's mind grew stronger. They talked, not just Marin talking and Thurin listening, but actual conversation back and forth, an exchange of thoughts and ideas and feelings that revealed Thurin to be far more than a mere animal. It was intelligent, profoundly, unsettlingly intelligent. It had memories that stretched back centuries, knowledge of a world that predated the Tethrian Empire by millennia. It understood things about the nature of reality that Marin could not follow, concepts that made his head ache when he tried to grasp them. But it also understood loneliness. It understood what it meant to be the last of something, to carry the weight of an entire species' extinction in your bones. It understood what it meant to be hunted, to be hated, to be told that your very existence was an offense to the order of the world. "You saved me," Thurin said one night, its voice carrying a tenderness that Marin felt in his chest like a physical warmth. "Not just from death, from something worse than death, from the belief that I deserved to die. I had been alone for so long, Marin, wounded, starving, abandoned by my own kind because there were no others to be found. I had begun to believe the things the Empire said about us, that we were monsters, that the world would be better without us, that my suffering was justified. Marin listened without interrupting. You fed me, Thurin continued. You bandaged my wing. You sat with me in the rain and talked to me as if I were a person. You looked at me with something in your eyes that I had never seen directed at a dragon before. Not fear, not hatred, not even pity. What did you see? Marin asked quietly. Kindness, Thurin said, simple, uncomplicated kindness. And it broke something inside me that needed to be broken, and it built something new in its place. The 120th night was the last night Marin saw Thurin in its old form. He arrived at the clearing and knew immediately that something was different. The air was charged, electric, carrying a static tension that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The rain had stopped for the first time in months, and the sky above was clear, revealing a canopy of stars so dense and bright that they seemed close enough to touch. Thurin was standing in the center of the clearing, not lying down. Standing on all four legs, its head raised high, its wings half spread. It was larger than it had ever been, easily twice the size it had been when Marin first found it, and still growing, its body expanding in slow, pulsing waves that rippled through its scales like waves on dark water. Its eyes were no longer merely fire. They were suns. Two miniature suns that blazed with a light so intense that Marin had to shield his face, and even through his hands he could feel the heat of that gaze, the power of it, the terrifying, beautiful, incomprehensible power of it. Marin, Thurin's voice filled his mind, and this time it was not alone. There were other voices woven into it, layers upon layers of sound and meaning, as if every dragon that had ever lived was speaking through Thurin's throat. It is time. Time for what? Marin's voice was barely a whisper. The ascension, what I told you about, what has been building since the night you first fed me. Thurin's body trembled and the ground beneath Marin's feet trembled with it. I did not understand it then. I did not understand why a single act of kindness could trigger something so vast, but I understand now. Tell me. In the old world, before the Empire, before the wars and the purges, there was a truth that everyone knew. Dragons were not merely creatures, we were conduits. Bridges between the physical world and something larger, something that has no name in your language. The ascension occurs when a dragon is brought back from the edge of death by an act of pure, selfless love. Not romantic love, not familial love. The love that gives without expectation of return. The love that sees suffering and refuses to look away. Marin felt tears on his cheeks. He did not wipe them away. You gave me that love, Thurin said. You, a human, a member of the species that has done more to destroy my kind than any other force in existence. You looked at me, a dragon, wounded and dying in the mud, and you saw not a monster, not an enemy, not a thing to be feared or exploited, but a being that needed help. And you helped me, at risk to your own life, without hesitation, without condition. I just did what anyone would. No, the word was absolute, final, carrying the weight of absolute truth. No one else would have, that is precisely the point. You did it because of who you are, Marin Ashward, and who you are is why this is happening. The light emanating from Thurin's body was becoming unbearable. The clearing was bathed in it, the trees around them casting sharp black shadows that stretched and twisted like living things. The ground was shaking continuously now, a deep, rhythmic vibration that Marin felt in his teeth, in his skull, in the hollow spaces behind his eyes. I must leave, Thurin said. The final stage of the ascension cannot be completed here. It must be done in the place between places, the space where the old world touches the new. I will be gone for a time. How long? Marin's voice broke on the question. I do not know, time moves differently where I am going. What is years for you may be moments for me, or moments for you may be years for me, I cannot say. Thurin lowered its enormous head until it was level with Marin's face, and for the first time Marin saw something in those sun-bright eyes that he recognized. Fear. Not fear of what was coming, but fear of what it meant to leave. But I will return, Thurin said. This I swear to you, Marin Ashward, on every memory of every dragon that has ever lived. I will return to you. And when I do, I will repay what you gave me 1,000 times over. I don't need repayment, Marin said. I never. I know. The voice in his mind was gentle, so gentle, carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with fire. That is why I must give it. Thurin pressed its forehead against Marin's chest, and Marin felt the heat of it, the impossible, beautiful heat. And he pressed both hands against the dragon's snout and held on as the light around them reached its peak, blazing white-hot, turning the entire valley into noon-bright daylight in the middle of the night. Then there was a sound like the world breaking open. And Thurin was gone. Marin stood alone in the clearing, his hands still raised, his chest still warm where the dragon's head had rested. The light faded slowly, retreating from the trees, from the ground, from the sky, until the stars were all that remained, cold and distant and utterly silent. He lowered his hands. He looked at the empty space where Thurin had been. Then he walked back up the ridge to the village, went to his small house, and sat in the dark for a very long time. Years passed. 5 of them, 5 long, quiet, ordinary years in which nothing remarkable happened to Marin Ashford. He continued his work. He continued his life. He went through the motions of existence with the same steady, unremarkable reliability that had always defined him. But something had changed. He could feel it, a presence at the edge of his awareness, like a word on the tip of his tongue or a face half-remembered from a dream. It was warm, it was vast, and it was always there, a constant low hum in the background of his consciousness that he could not explain and could not ignore. He did not tell anyone about Thurin, not a single soul. The secret sat inside him like a second heartbeat, silent and steady and eternal. Sometimes, in the deep watches of the night, he would reach out with his mind, not knowing how he knew to do this, only that he did, and he would brush against something immeasurable, something that recognized him and responded with a pulse of warmth so intense that it brought tears to his eyes. He aged, not badly, not quickly, but visibly. His hair thinned. Lines appeared around his eyes, deeper than they should have been for a man in his late 30s. The work was hard and the food was scarce and the winters were cold, and his body bore the accumulated evidence of a life lived at the edge of survival. But he did not despair. He could not despair. Not with that warmth inside him, that promise, that unbreakable thread connecting him to something that was growing larger and more extraordinary with every passing day. He felt it growing. Whatever Thurin was becoming, wherever it was, Marin could sense the expansion of it, the way a man standing on a shore can sense the rising of a tide even when he cannot see the water. It was becoming something immense, something that made the mountains seem small, something that made the sky seem close. Something divine. The day Thurin returned, the sky turned black at noon. Not the black of a storm, not the black of an eclipse, a black that was absolute, complete, that swallowed every photon of light and gave nothing back. The villagers of Durnholt screamed and ran for their homes. Children wailed, animals panicked. The world went dark and silent and still, as if creation itself had drawn a breath and held it. Marin stood in the center of the village. He did not run, he did not scream. He looked up at the impossible darkness and felt the warmth inside him flare into a blaze, and he knew. He knew. The darkness broke. Not gradually all at once like a shattering, like the sky itself was made of glass and something had struck it from the other side. And through the cracks light poured in, not sunlight, not starlight, not any kind of light that had ever existed in the history of the world. It was the color of nothing and everything at once. It was the light that existed before the first star ignited, the light that would exist after the last star died. It was the light of the space between spaces, the place where Thurin had gone, the place where the old world touched the new. And descending through that light, through the shattered remnants of the noon sky, was a dragon. But it was not the dragon Marin remembered. It was enormous, not the size of a house, not the size of a hill, the size of a mountain. Its wings spanned the entire valley, and the membrane of those wings was not flesh but something translucent and luminous, like the fabric of reality itself stretched thin enough to see through. Its scales were the black of the void between stars, and within that black, galaxies swirled. Actual galaxies. Spiral arms of light turning slowly in the darkness of the dragon's hide, nebulae blooming and fading, stars being born and dying in cycles that took seconds but contained millennia. Its eyes were twin supernovae. Its breath was the wind that shaped worlds. It was a god, there was no other word for it. The old texts that the Empire had burned had called them the Worldborn, the Skyforged, the Eternal Flame made flesh. Dragons were not merely creatures. They had never been merely creatures. They were the scaffolding upon which reality was built, the pillars that held the sky above the earth, the breath that filled the lungs of the world. And Thurin, the small, wounded, starving dragon that Marin had fed in secret, in the rain, in the mud, with nothing but a sack of scraps and a heart too kind for its own good, had become one of them. The dragon, the god, descended into the valley and landed with an impact that shook the earth to its foundations. Trees bent away from it like grass before a gale. The river reversed its flow for a single, impossible moment. The stone walls of Durnholt cracked but did not fall, held in place by some force that Marin could feel but not see. Every person in the village was on their knees. Not by choice, their legs had simply given out, bowled over by the sheer gravitational weight of a divine presence made manifest. They were weeping, screaming, praying to gods they had forgotten they believed in. Some had fainted. Others were staring with blank, uncomprehending eyes, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. Marin stood. He stood because the warmth inside him would not let him fall. It flowed through his body like molten gold, filling his limbs, straightening his spine, lifting his chin. He stood in the presence of a god, and he was not afraid because that god knew his name. Thurin lowered its head, a head the size of the village square, and brought it down to where Marin stood, and those eyes, those supernova eyes, focused on him with an intensity that would have vaporized anything else in existence. But Marin felt only warmth, only love, only the same gentle presence that had pressed against his chest on a rainy night 5 years ago when a dying dragon had rested its head on a nobody's heart and found a reason to live. "You came back," Marin said. His voice was steady, his eyes were wet. "I told you I would." The voice filled the world, not just Marin's mind, the entire world. Every living thing in the valley, every bird and insect and blade of grass heard those words and understood them in their own way. "I told you that when I returned I would repay what you gave me. I told you I didn't need. And I told you that was why I must." Thurin's voice softened, and the softness of a god's voice was a thing of terrifying beauty, a sound that could make stars weep. "Marin Ashward, you fed me when I was starving, you healed me when I was broken, you named me when I was nameless. You gave me your kindness without condition, without expectation, without reservation. And in doing so you did not merely save a dragon." Thurin's eyes blazed brighter, and the galaxies in its scales spun faster, and the light that poured from its wings illuminated the world in colors that had no names. "You reminded the universe what kindness is." The ground beneath Marin's feet began to glow. Softly at first, then brighter, a warm golden light that spread outward from where he stood in ever-widening circles. It seeped into the earth, into the stone walls of the village, into the muddy roads and the flooded fields. Wherever it touched, things changed. The cracks in the walls sealed themselves. The mud dried and hardened into rich, dark soil. The flooded fields drained, and in their place, barley sprang up, green, golden, impossibly abundant. A harvest that would feed the village for a year. The light reached the people. Those who had fainted woke, confused but unharmed. Those who had wept found their tears dried, their fear replaced by a profound and inexplicable peace. Those who had stared with blank eyes blinked and looked around with clear, calm gazes, as if they had been born anew. Marin watched it happen, and he understood. "You're healing them," he said. "I am healing what I can," Thurin said. "The land, the people, the wounds that have been inflicted on this valley by neglect, by poverty, by the slow erosion of hope. This is what I can give. This is the first installment of a debt that can never be fully repaid." "And me?" Marin asked. "What about me?" Thurin was quiet for a moment. The silence of a god was not empty, it was full, overflowing, containing multitudes. "I cannot make you young again," Thurin said. "That is not within my power, nor would I do it if it were. Your years, your hardships, your struggles, they are part of what made you capable of the kindness you showed me. To erase them would be to erase the very thing I am honoring." "Then what?" Thurin's head came closer, so close that Marin could feel the heat of its breath washing over him, carrying with it the scent of starlight and ancient stone and something that tasted like the first rain of spring. "I can give you this," Thurin said. "You will not age further, not from this moment. The years that remain to you will be healthy, strong, and free from pain. You will not sicken, you will not weaken. You will live out your natural span in full possession of your faculties, and when your time comes, it will come gently in sleep, in peace, in warmth." Marin's breath caught. He felt the change as it happened, felt the aches in his joints dissolve, felt the heaviness in his lungs lift, felt the fog that had been gathering at the edges of his mind clear away like morning mist before the sun. His body felt the way it had at 25, strong, capable, alive. "But that is not all," Thurin continued. "You will never be unseen again, Marin, not because I will force the world to look at you, but because you will no longer be able to hide. The light I have given you will shine through everything you do. Every act of kindness, every word of comfort, every moment of quiet, unremarkable generosity, the world will see it, and the world will remember." Marin closed his eyes, tears ran down his cheeks, and he let them. "There is one more thing," Thurin said, and now the god's voice carried something that Marin had never heard in it before, something that sounded almost like vulnerability. "The bond between us is eternal. It transcends death, transcends time, transcends the boundaries of worlds. When your life ends, whenever that may be, centuries from now, you will not pass into nothing. You will come to me, you will take your place beside me in the space between spaces, and you will be what I am." Marin opened his eyes. "What you are," he repeated. "A god?" Thurin's voice was barely a whisper now, soft as the fall of a single snowflake in a silent forest. "The first human to ever become one, not through conquest or ritual or sacrifice, through kindness. Through the simple, radical, world-shattering act of feeding a hungry dragon in the rain because it was the right thing to do." The light around them was fading now, the impossible colors retreating, the galaxies in Thurin's scales dimming to a gentle, steady glow. The sky above was returning to normal, blue, ordinary, beautiful in its mundanity. The god was folding itself back into the world, compressing its infinite vastness into a form that would not shatter reality merely by existing within it. When the light had faded entirely, Thurin stood in the valley, large, yes, larger than any living dragon had a right to be, but not mountain-sized. Not world-breaking. Its scales were black and depthless, its eyes were bright with inner fire, and its torn wing bore a scar that would never fully heal. It looked like a dragon, a magnificent, powerful, ancient dragon, but not a god, not anymore. Not here in the mundane world where gods could not walk without breaking the things they touched. But Marin knew the truth, and Thurin knew he knew, and that was enough. The villagers were stirring, rising slowly to their feet, looking around in dazed wonder at the transformed valley, the healed walls, the abundant crops, the clear, clean roads. They were talking among themselves in frightened, excited whispers, trying to piece together what had happened, failing utterly. Marin walked toward Thurin. The dragon lowered its head and pressed its forehead against his chest, just as it had done 5 years ago, and Marin placed his hands on its snout and held on. "Thank you," Marin said. "No," Thurin said, its voice now confined to his mind alone, warm and intimate and his. "Thank you." The Tethrian Empire came eventually, they always did. Riders in black armor bearing the Silver Hawk standard arrived in Durnholt 3 months after Thurin's return. They had heard reports, impossible reports, of a dragon sighting in the Cathara Valley of a village that had been blessed by some unknown force. They came to investigate, to punish, to eradicate. They found Marin Ashward standing at the edge of the village, exactly where he had stood 5 years ago when he had first looked down into the valley and seen a dying creature that needed help. Behind him, barely visible against the tree line, a pair of eyes like molten copper, no, like living fire, watched from the darkness. The lead rider drew his sword. "We have reports of a dragon in this area. You will tell us what you know, or you will be detained for questioning." Marin looked at him. He was not afraid. He would never be afraid again. "There's no dragon here," he said calmly. The rider sneered. "We have eyewitness accounts from—" "Have you considered," Marin interrupted, with a quietness that carried further than it should have, "that perhaps what people saw was not a monster to be feared, but a reminder that the world is larger than your empire?" The rider's horse shifted nervously. The animal could feel what its rider could not: the presence in the trees, the warmth in the air, the faint scent of smoke and stone and something ancient. "You would do well to watch your tone, villager," the rider said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "I'm just a laborer," Marin said. "I fix bridges and bring firewood to the elderly. I don't know anything about dragons." He paused, looked the rider in the eye with a gaze that was, for just a moment, not quite human, that held depths and distances that no ordinary man's eyes could contain. "But if I did," Marin said softly, "I would tell you this: the dragons are coming back, not because they want war, not because they want revenge, but because someone remembered that they were worth saving. And if your empire wants to stop that, it will need more than swords and armor. It will need to understand something it has spent 2 centuries trying to destroy." "And what is that?" Marin smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and unremarkable, the kind of smile that would not have drawn a second glance from anyone who didn't look closely enough. "Kindness," he said. "The Empire will need to understand kindness." The riders left. They did not find the dragon. They did not find evidence of any dragon. They returned to their garrison and filed a report that was filed away and forgotten, because in the grand machinery of an empire, one village's impossible story was nothing but noise. But in the years that followed, the stories multiplied. Dragons were seen in the far mountains. Dragons were seen over the northern forests. Dragons were seen in places where dragons had not been seen for generations, and they were not attacking, were not burning, were not doing any of the terrible things the Empire's propaganda had promised they would do. They were simply existing, flying, hunting, living. And in the Cathara Valley, in the village of Durnholt, a man who had once been a nobody stood at the edge of the world and watched the sky with dark eyes that held the light of stars. And he smiled his quiet, unremarkable smile, and he waited for the dawn. Because he knew with a certainty that was woven into his bones, that was threaded through his soul, that was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat, that the world was changing. And it had changed because of him. Not because he was powerful, not because he was special, not because he was chosen by prophecy or destiny or fate. Because he had seen something hungry and alone and hurting, and he had fed it. That was all, that was everything. And in the end, that was enough. In the annals of the new era, when historians wrote of the return of the worldborn, they would debate the cause for centuries. Scholars would propose theories, cosmic cycles, magical convergences, the shifting of planetary alignments. Empires would claim credit. Religions would claim divine intervention. Armies would take up banners in the names of 100 different causes, all claiming to be the reason the dragons came back. None of them got it right. The truth was simpler than any of them could imagine, and more extraordinary than any of them could accept. A hungry dragon was fed by a kind man. That was the beginning of everything. That was the seed from which a new world grew. And the man's name was Marin Ashward, and he was a nobody from a village no one had heard of, and he changed the course of history with a sack of scraps and a heart that refused to look away from suffering. Remember that when the world tells you that kindness is small, when the powerful tell you that compassion is weakness, when the cynical tell you that one person cannot make a difference. Remember Marin Ashward. Remember that he fed a hungry dragon in secret. And the dragon became a god. And the god remembered. And the world was never the same.